The day starts like any other for Officer David Thompson, a seasoned police officer who has spent over a decade on the force in his small but growing city. On the surface, David appears to be a model cop. He has a clean record, his colleagues respect him, and his experience has earned him a reputation for being sharp and assertive. However, underneath this polished exterior, David is not immune to the subtle but pervasive biases that affect many in law enforcement. These biases, largely unnoticed even by David himself, are about to set off a chain of events that will alter the course of his life forever. David grew up in a working-class neighborhood, raised with a strong belief in law and order. His father was a security guard, and his mother worked as a school teacher. They instilled in him a strong sense of duty and respect for authority. As a young man, David saw the police as the ultimate symbol of justice and protection, and joining the force had been a dream of his since childhood. His early days on the job were filled with enthusiasm and a sense of purpose, but over the years the city had changed, and so had David. The once thriving urban center where he worked had fallen into decline, crime rates had risen sharply, and social tensions were simmering just below the surface. The city was divided along racial and economic lines, with many low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods struggling with poverty, drug addiction, and high levels of violence. For David, these neighborhoods became synonymous with danger. He found himself more on edge when patrolling certain areas, and his interactions with the residents were often colored by a deep-seated suspicion, though he would never admit it. This unspoken prejudice would soon come to the forefront. The atmosphere within the police department mirrored the city's growing division. Recent incidents of police misconduct, particularly those involving race, had stoked tensions between the police force and the community. Officers were increasingly seen as adversaries rather than protectors by many in the city. Protests, media scrutiny, and political pressure weighed heavily on the department, leading to an us versus them mentality among many of the officers. Including David. In moments of frustration, he would vent to his colleagues, echoing the sentiment that the community had turned its back on the police, that they no longer appreciated the sacrifices officers made to keep the streets safe. One officer, however, stood out as a symbol of hope and change amidst the chaos: Captain Marcus Green. Captain Green, a black man in his mid-40s, had risen through the ranks with an impeccable record. He was known not only for his skill and leadership, but also for his dedication to bridging the gap between the police and the community. Green had worked tirelessly to build trust, particularly in the neighborhoods that had seen the most friction with law enforcement. His approach was one of empathy and understanding, qualities that earned him the respect of both the police force and the people they served. To many, Captain Green represented the future of policing, one where officers could be both enforcers of the law and partners to the community. Despite his reputation, not all officers saw Green's methods as effective. Some, like David, viewed Green's community outreach efforts with skepticism. To David, it felt like unnecessary hand-holding, an attempt to placate a community that didn't want to be policed. "They'll never respect us," he'd mutter to himself after attending one of Green's many meetings with local leaders. And so, David's admiration for Captain Green remained professional but distant, tinged with a subtle resentment that he couldn't fully articulate. On this particular day, David's shift began like any other, patrolling the usual streets, responding to calls, and keeping a watchful eye on the city. The radio crackled with minor incidents: a fender bender on 8th Avenue, a domestic disturbance near the old industrial park. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as he drove through the dilapidated streets of one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, something caught his eye. A man standing alone near the entrance of an apartment complex. He was tall, well-built, and dressed in plain clothes, but there was something about his demeanor that set off alarm bells in David's mind. The man seemed too calm, too confident, standing in an area known for drug activity and gang violence. Without thinking twice, David slowed his patrol car and radioed in a suspicious person. The dispatcher responded with a routine acknowledgement, and David, feeling the weight of responsibility, stepped out of his vehicle. As he approached the man, He felt his pulse quicken. He didn't know why, but something about this situation felt off. Years of experience had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, his gut was telling him that this man didn't belong here. "Excuse me," Sir David said, his voice firm but controlled. "Can I see some identification?" The man turned to face him, his expression calm and composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone polite but with an unmistakable air of authority. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sized up the man in front of him. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, hardly the attire of a criminal, but David's instincts screamed otherwise. This guy's hiding something, he thought to himself. He had seen it 100 times before suspects who played it cool until the moment they tried to run or lash out. David's hand instinctively hovered near his belt, ready to react at a moment's notice. "I need to see your ID," David repeated, his patience wearing thin. The man raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "I don't see why that's necessary. I'm not doing anything wrong, just heading home." David felt his frustration mounting. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to stonewall him during a stop, but something about the man's calm demeanor irked him even more. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'm going to have to take you down to the station until we can confirm your identity." The man sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a wallet. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, handing over his identification. David snatched the ID and glanced at it. His heart skipped a beat as he read the name, Marcus Green. Captain Marcus Green, the very man David had seen multiple times at the station, the man whose face he should have recognized instantly. But here, on the street, out of uniform, in a neighborhood David had come to associate with criminals and troublemakers, he hadn't made the connection. Now it was too late. Panic set in. He had just demanded ID from one of the highest-ranking officers in the department, treating him like a common suspect. But instead of backing down or apologizing, David's pride took over. He couldn't afford to look weak or indecisive, not in front of a potential threat, even if that threat was his superior officer. "Stay where you are," David ordered, his voice harder than he intended. He radioed for backup, convinced that something was still amiss. His biases, deeply ingrained and seldom questioned, blinded him to the reality of the situation. Marcus Green wasn't just a man standing on the street. He was a decorated police captain, a man who had spent his life fighting for justice and equality. But to David, in that moment, Green was simply another suspect, another potential danger in a world that had become too dangerous to trust. This was the moment that would change everything. Officer David Thompson's heart raced as he stared at Captain Marcus Green, who stood calm and collected despite the growing tension. The situation had spiraled out of David's control, but he couldn't admit that. His pride, coupled with a deep fear of humiliation, locked him in place. Green's patient voice echoed in his mind. "You've made a mistake, Officer Thompson. Let's de-escalate." But the part of David that had built his career on authority, respect, and control wouldn't let him back down. Not now, not with backup arriving and a crowd gathering. When officers Johnson and Perez arrived on the scene, David could feel the heat of their judgment. Their confusion was palpable as they took in the sight of Captain Green standing in handcuffs. Johnson, the senior of the two, approached cautiously, his brow furrowed. "David, what's going on here?" Johnson's voice carried a mix of disbelief and caution. David's throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but backing down now felt impossible. His mind was a whirl of justifications, each one more fragile than the last. "Just following procedure," he muttered, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. His eyes flicked to Green, then back to Johnson. "He says he's Captain Green, but I need to confirm." Johnson's face twisted in shock. "Captain Green? David, come on, you know who he is." David's gut churned. He did know. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to let this go, but fear and pride had formed a wall around him. His colleague's arrival only intensified the pressure. Admitting his mistake now in front of them, in front of a growing crowd would shatter his image. He couldn't afford that. "Just follow protocol," David said, his voice harsher than intended. It was an order to himself as much as to his colleagues. Johnson and Perez exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Perez spoke up, her voice laced with concern. "David, we don't need to do this. We can sort it out here." David's heart pounded in his chest as the implications of his actions began to weigh on him. Every second he kept Green in cuffs, the situation worsened. He felt trapped, like a dam about to burst. But rather than letting the truth flow, he piled on more sandbags, more denial. "I said we take him in," David repeated, his voice trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it with authority. Captain Green, still composed, took a deep breath. "Officer Thompson, I understand this is difficult, but you're making it worse. We can stop this before it escalates any further." Those words, calm and rational, hit David like a sledgehammer. He knew Green was right, but fear clutched at his chest. How could he face the fallout? His colleagues would never look at him the same way. Worse, he feared losing their respect, and in his mind, that was a fate worse than anything else. In that moment, the sound of murmurs from the crowd pulled David out of his spiraling thoughts. People had begun to gather, some filming the scene on their phones. The hum of the crowd grew louder as they whispered and pointed, some already recognizing Captain Green. One voice pierced through the noise. "That's Captain Green. They're arresting one of their own." A surge of panic gripped David as the reality of the situation became unavoidable. His every move was being recorded. His mistake was now a public spectacle, and the world would soon judge him for it. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, burning into his skin as the crowd's energy shifted from confusion to outrage. Perez, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward again, her tone more urgent this time. "David, the crowd's getting restless. This is turning into something much bigger. We need to end this." David's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. He knew she was right, but his mind couldn't let go. The fear of losing face, of becoming the officer who made the biggest mistake of his career, consumed him. The image of his colleagues whispering behind his back, the thought of becoming a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons, froze him in place. Johnson leaned in closer, his voice low but firm. "David, this is going live. It's all over social media already. If you don't stop this now, it's going to blow up and we'll all be in the middle of it." The weight of those words pressed down on David like a boulder. His mind flashed with images of his name plastered across the internet. The headlines, "Officer arrests his own captain by mistake." His stomach churned with fear, but still, he couldn't back down. He had already crossed the line, and now it felt too late to retreat. "We take him in," David repeated, though the strength in his voice had faded, replaced by a hollow echo of the authority he once commanded. Captain Green's calm, collected voice broke through again, though now there was a hint of disappointment. "David, I know this is hard, but sometimes the hardest thing is admitting when we're wrong. Let's put an end to this before it gets worse." David's breath hitched in his throat. He knew Green was offering him a way out, a chance to stop the madness, but the weight of his pride crushed any sense of reason. His voice cracked as he barked, "Take him in." Perez and Johnson exchanged glances, their frustration evident. Reluctantly, they moved to take Captain Green into custody, though their actions were slow, almost hesitant, as if they were trying to delay the inevitable. Johnson placed his hand gently on Green's arm, while Perez avoided eye contact with David altogether. As Green was led to the patrol car, the murmur from the crowd turned into a full-blown uproar. People shouted in disbelief, their phones raised high to capture every moment. "This is going live," one woman shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They're arresting their own captain." David's heart sank as the realization hit him like a freight train. He had gone too far. There was no turning back now. The situation had escalated beyond his control, and the consequences were already unfolding before his eyes. As Captain Green was placed in the back of the patrol car, the weight of his decision settled heavily on David's shoulders. His chest tightened with the crushing realization that his actions had not only tarnished his own reputation but had likely set off a chain reaction that would affect the entire department. The patrol car pulled away, taking Captain Green with it, and David was left standing in the middle of the street, the eyes of the crowd still burning into him. His colleagues looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief, but no one said a word. The silence was louder than any criticism they could have voiced. Inside, David's world had already started to crumble. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers, his authority shattered by the very pride he had tried to protect. As the crowd dispersed, he stood alone, frozen in the aftermath of his own choices, knowing that everything had just changed and not for the better. Officer David Thompson stood rooted to the spot, the hollow weight of his actions sinking deeper with each passing second. Captain Marcus Green was gone, driven away in the back of a patrol car. The silence left in his wake was almost unbearable, broken only by the low murmur of the few remaining onlookers who continued filming. David could feel their eyes on him, judging, questioning, and accusing, as if their phones had captured not just his actions but the very core of his failure. The realization of what he'd done hit him like a punch to the gut. His career, no, his entire life had taken a sharp and irreversible turn, all because of a decision born out of fear, pride, and unchecked bias. The adrenaline that had surged through his veins earlier was now replaced by a creeping sense of dread. He wanted to rationalize it, tell himself that he had just been following protocol, but deep down, he knew better. He'd crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. Johnson and Perez stood nearby, their expressions dark and filled with a mix of frustration and disappointment. David could feel the rift growing between them, as if an invisible wall had suddenly been erected. They had tried to stop him. They had tried to pull him back from the edge. And now, standing in the aftermath of his own choices, David could see in their eyes that he had lost something even more valuable than his pride, their respect. Johnson was the first to break the heavy silence. "David, we need to talk," he said, his voice strained with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. David didn't respond immediately. His mind was too busy racing through the events, trying to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. He was still clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. If they got back to the station quickly enough, maybe they could smooth things over. Maybe this could still be fixed. David Johnson's voice was sharper this time, pulling David back to the present. "We need to talk now." David turned to face him, but the look on Johnson's face only intensified his dread, the disappointment, the frustration. It was all there, written plainly in his expression. "I was just." Following procedure, David mumbled, the words feeling weak and empty even to him. Perez, who had been silent until now, couldn't hold back any longer. "Procedure," she repeated, incredulous. "David, what you did wasn't procedure. You escalated the situation." He was trying to de-escalate, and knew. She stopped herself, shaking her head. The frustration in her voice was palpable. "You didn't have to go that far." David's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger rising in his chest, not at Perez but at himself. He knew she was right. He knew that, in that critical moment, his fear and pride had clouded his judgment. But admitting that now, especially in front of them, felt like too much. His reputation, his standing as an officer, everything was crumbling around him, and the weight of it was crushing. Johnson sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "David, this isn't something that's just going to blow over. It's all over social media now. People are talking." They saw what happened. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a tone filled with both concern and warning. "This is big. And it's going to get bigger." David felt his stomach churn. He didn't need Johnson to spell it out, he already knew. The moment the phones came out, the moment people started recording, his actions had gone from a mistake made in the heat of the moment to a public spectacle. And now there was no controlling the narrative. His career, his future, everything was now in the hands of people watching from behind their screens. As the three officers stood in the tense quiet, The radio crackled to life, the voice of their superior, Chief Taylor, cutting through the air with urgency. Thompson, Johnson, Perez, get back to the station immediately. We need to debrief about the incident involving Captain Green. Do not engage with anyone on your way back. Understood. David's pulse quickened. The cold, clipped tone of Chief Taylor's voice was like a slap in the face. There was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just an internal conversation anymore, it was a crisis. David swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper, and gave a weak nod, though he knew Taylor couldn't see him. Understood, Chief Johnson responded, his voice steady, though the tension was still thick in the air. He turned to David, his expression a mix of warning and resignation. Let's go. The drive back to the station was suffocating. David could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, his mind spiraling into worst-case scenarios. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Perez and Johnson sat in stony silence beside him, their previous camaraderie replaced by an uncomfortable distance. It was as if an invisible wall had gone up between them, one that David knew he had built himself. As they pulled into the station, David's stomach lurched. Officers were already talking. He could see them huddled in small groups, exchanging glances as they whispered amongst themselves. He didn't need to hear what they were saying. The way their eyes flicked toward him as he walked past said everything. His colleagues knew. And the rumor mill was already in full swing. Inside the station, the tension was even thicker. David's heart raced as he made his way toward the conference room, where Chief Taylor waited. Every step felt like it brought him closer to the inevitable fallout, and the weight of it was unbearable. He could feel sweat gathering on his forehead, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. The moment he stepped into the room, Chief Taylor's gaze locked onto him with a cold intensity. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just the sharp focus of a man who had just been thrown into damage control. He gestured for David, Johnson, and Perez to sit. Taylor didn't waste any time. "You know why we're here," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Captain Green was arrested today by one of our own officers, in front of a crowd, and that crowd captured everything on video." David's heart sank further with each word. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but no words came. His mouth felt dry, his mind scrambling for an explanation that could somehow make this all go away, but there was nothing. Taylor's eyes narrowed as he turned his attention directly to David. "I want to know what the hell happened out there." David swallowed hard. The walls seemed to close in around him as he tried to find a way to explain himself. I thought he was a suspect, he started, but even as he said the words, he could feel how weak they sounded. He wasn't in uniform. And Taylor cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Thompson, that's not good enough. You know it. And I know it. This wasn't about him being out of uniform. This was about the fact that you let your own biases cloud your judgment. You saw a black man in that neighborhood and assumed the worst." David's breath hitched. The cold truth of Taylor's words hit him like a ton of bricks. His mind flashed back to the moment when he'd first seen Green standing there, out of uniform, in an area David had long associated with crime and danger. He had acted on instinct, on fear, without even realizing it. "There's going to be an internal investigation," Taylor continued, his voice hard and unyielding. "The mayor's office is already involved. This is going to blow up, and we're going to be dealing with the fallout for a long time." David felt his stomach twist into knots. An internal investigation meant his actions would be scrutinized down to the smallest detail. There would be no escaping the consequences now. His career, his reputation, everything was at risk. As the meeting dragged on, David's mind raced with fear and regret. His body felt heavy like lead as he sat there, absorbing the full weight of what he had done. The threat of suspension, or worse, loomed large. But even more unbearable was the knowledge that he had betrayed the very principles he had sworn to uphold. When the meeting finally ended, David walked out in a daze. His legs felt like they would give out beneath him at any moment, but he forced himself to keep moving. His colleagues, once friends, now barely glanced at him as he made his way back to his desk. The whispers followed him, a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. David sat down heavily, staring blankly at the screen of his computer. His career, once defined by confidence and control, now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And the worst part, he knew it was all his fault. Officer David Thompson felt the world closing in around him. The fallout from the arrest of Captain Marcus Green was already beginning to take shape, and the tension in the department had reached a boiling point. He was no longer just a respected officer among his peers, he was the officer who arrested one of their own, a decorated black captain no less, based on a mistake rooted in bias. Every step he took in the station was met with whispers, side glances and unspoken judgments that clung to him like a dark cloud. David sat at his desk, the silence around him deafening. His colleagues, once friendly and approachable, now avoided him. Even the casual chatter that usually filled the room had fallen away whenever he entered. The air was thick with the weight of what had happened, and David could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him. His career was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chief Taylor had been crystal clear during their debriefing. The incident with Captain Green had gone viral, and the city's leaders were already involved. The mayor's office had demanded a full investigation, and public pressure was mounting by the hour. Every news outlet was covering the story. Social media was flooded with videos of the arrest, and the narrative was quickly spiraling out of control. David's name had become synonymous with racial bias and police misconduct. The department had to act fast. They needed to protect their reputation, and David knew he would be the sacrificial lamb. The thought gnawed at him as he stared blankly at his computer screen, trying to force himself to focus on his work. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept drifting back to that fateful moment, the moment when he had seen Captain Green standing on that street, out of uniform, and had made a snap judgment. A judgment that, at the time, had seemed justified, but now stood out in stark relief as the biggest mistake of his career. David's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his desk. He looked up to see Johnson, his longtime colleague and former friend, standing there with a conflicted expression on his face. The tension between them had been palpable ever since the incident, and now it seemed like Johnson had something important to say. David Johnson started, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk." David felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been dreading, the conversation that would likely determine the future of his career. Johnson pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, his eyes searching David's face for any sign of remorse or understanding. "Look," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been through hell these past few days. I get it. But the department, the guys, they're not taking this well. None of us are." David looked down at his hands, avoiding Johnson's gaze. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to face it. "They're talking about you," David Johnson continued, "and not just the usual gossip. People are questioning whether you should even still be on the force." David's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I was just doing my job." Johnson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Doing your job? David, you arrested the captain of our department, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras. It's not just about doing your job, it's about how you did it." David finally met Johnson's gaze, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I was following protocol. He wasn't in uniform, and I didn't recognize him at first. I couldn't take any chances." Johnson shook his head. "But it wasn't about protocol, and you know it. You let your biases cloud your judgment. We all saw it. David, you saw a black man in a neighborhood you don't trust, and you made assumptions." David opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew Johnson was right. He had acted on instinct, on fear, but admitting that felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that everything he had worked for, all his years of service, had been tainted by something he couldn't control. Johnson leaned forward, his voice softening. "Look, I'm not saying you're a bad cop, but you made a mistake. A big one. And now, the whole department is paying for it. We're all under scrutiny because of what happened." David's mind raced as he tried to process everything. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had just been trying to keep the streets safe, but the words felt hollow. How could he justify what he had done when the evidence was so damning? Before he could respond, the door to the squad room opened, and Chief Taylor stepped inside, his expression grim. "Thompson, I need you in my office, now." David's stomach dropped. The knot in his chest tightened as he stood up, exchanging a tense glance with Johnson before following Chief Taylor down the hall. The walk to Taylor's office felt like a march toward his own execution. Every step was heavy, every breath labored. When they arrived, Taylor closed the door behind them and gestured for David to sit. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, and David could feel the weight of Taylor's gaze on him. "We have a problem," David Taylor began, his tone cold and matter-of-fact. "The mayor's office has been in constant contact with me, and they're demanding answers. The city is up in arms over what happened, and the public outcry is only growing." David swallowed hard. He had known this was coming, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all the more terrifying. "The media has turned this into a full-blown scandal," Taylor continued, his eyes never leaving David's. "They're calling for your suspension, possibly even your termination, and to be honest, I don't know if there's anything I can do to stop it." David's heart pounded in his chest. The room felt like it was closing in on him. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said again, his voice shaky. "I was just trying to do my job." Taylor's expression hardened. "That's not good enough. David, you made a snap judgment, and it's cost us dearly. The department's reputation is on the line, and so is yours." The words hit David like a sledgehammer. He had known things were bad, but hearing the reality of the situation from Chief Taylor made it all feel so much worse. His career, his future, everything he had worked for was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "The mayor's office has requested an internal investigation," Taylor said, his tone final. "You'll be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of that investigation. You'll be expected to cooperate fully." David felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. Administrative leave. An internal investigation. The words echoed in his mind, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. "I understand," David said quietly, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. There was nothing else he could say. He had no defense, no justification that would make this situation any better. Taylor stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "I'll let you know when the investigation begins. In the meantime, I suggest you get a lawyer." David's chest tightened at the mention of a lawyer. He hadn't even considered that this might go beyond the department, that he might need legal representation to defend himself. The idea of being dragged through the legal system, of having his every action scrutinized by people who didn't understand the pressure of being a cop, was terrifying. As he left Taylor's office, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was being pushed out, suspended, investigated. His career was on the verge of collapse, and there was no way to stop it. When he returned to the squad room, Johnson and Perez were waiting for him. Their expressions said it all. They knew what had happened. They knew he was finished. "What did Taylor say?" Johnson asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. David shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm being placed on administrative leave." Perez frowned, her disappointment palpable. "David, I'm sorry, but you had to know this was coming." David didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of his failure was too much to bear. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave the station, the reality of his situation hit him full force. The life he had known, the career he had built, was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. David Thompson trudged out of the station, the door slamming shut behind him with an unsettling finality. The sun blazed in the sky, but everything felt dim and distant to him, as if he were moving through a fog. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his actions had become a physical burden he couldn't escape. He had been placed on administrative leave, his career now dangling over the edge of an abyss, and there was nothing he could do to stop it from falling. As David walked, the murmurs and whispers from the station followed him. Even though the voices themselves were left behind, he had seen the judgment in the eyes of his colleagues, felt the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. It was as if they were waiting for him to break, for him to confess that, yes, he had messed up beyond repair, and deep down, David knew they were right. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he didn't bother to check it. It had been days since the arrest of Captain Green, and David's name was still plastered across every news outlet and social media platform. Every time he glanced at his phone, it was the same: another article, another viral video clip, another wave of outrage from the public. The most recent headline he saw before shoving his phone back into his pocket had read, "Officer Thompson, the face of racial bias in policing it stung." The shame and humiliation gnawed at him with every word. He had never imagined his career would come to this. Years of service, the respect he had built, all now overshadowed by one fateful moment. And the worst part, he couldn't even defend himself, not really. Deep down, he knew he had acted out of fear, out of bias, and now the world knew it too. The next few days dragged by in a blur. David spent most of his time locked in his apartment, curtains drawn to shut out the light. Outside, the world continued to move forward, but for David, time had stopped. His thoughts raced endlessly, cycling through regret, anger, fear, and frustration. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, his once comfortable apartment now feeling more like a prison cell. The news coverage of the incident only grew more intense. The arrest of Captain Green had become the focal point of every conversation about systemic racism in policing. Protests erupted in the streets, not just small, scattered gatherings, but massive, organized demonstrations demanding accountability. Community leaders and activists were calling for sweeping reforms, and David's name was at the center of it all. He had become the symbol of everything wrong with the system. It wasn't just the public either. Inside the department, the atmosphere was toxic. He hadn't set foot in the station since his suspension, but the texts he received from former colleagues made it clear where he stood. Some officers sent vague messages of support, but even those were laced with doubt. Others were more blunt, calling him out for bringing the heat down on everyone. They didn't care that it was an accident. They didn't care that he hadn't meant for things to go this way. All they saw was the fallout, and they blamed him for it. The union lawyer assigned to him had been clinical and cold in their conversations. The lawyer had laid out the facts in the starkest of terms. David was facing a serious internal investigation, and the likelihood of his termination was high. Worse still, if public pressure continued to build, there was a chance that he could face criminal charges. It was all out of his hands now. David barely touched his phone. The endless barrage of news notifications and missed calls from reporters left him feeling overwhelmed and powerless. The few times he allowed himself to scroll through social media, the comments were vicious. Strangers labeled him as the epitome of everything wrong with policing, as a racist, as a disgrace. The worst part was, he wasn't sure they were wrong. He had failed not just himself, but the system, the community, and the very values he had once believed in. It was the second protest that shook David to his core. He watched it unfold from his apartment window. The first protest had been small, spontaneous, angry citizens gathering outside the station, shouting for justice. But this one was massive. Thousands of people filled the streets, their chants echoing through the city, carried on the wind like a storm that had come to tear everything down. From his vantage point, David could see the signs waving in the air, bold letters demanding justice, reform, and accountability. Justice for Green End Police Racism, hold Thompson accountable. The crowd's voices rose in unison, a roar of anger and frustration that felt unstoppable. David's pulse quickened as he watched the scene unfold. He had never been on this side of things before. For years, he had been the one watching from within the system, the one standing behind the badge, enforcing order. Now, he was the target of their anger, the embodiment of the system they wanted to dismantle. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Johnson, his longtime colleague and friend. The sight of Johnson's name on the screen sent a wave of mixed emotions through David. He hadn't spoken to Johnson since the day he was suspended, and he wasn't sure what to expect from the message. "We need to talk. Meet me at the diner tomorrow, 8 a.m. David stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. He knew what this meeting was going to be, another reckoning. Johnson had always been more level-headed, the voice of reason when things got tough. But this was different. David wasn't sure he could face the disappointment in his friend's eyes, but something inside him, that last thread of hope, pulled him toward the idea that maybe, just maybe, Johnson could offer a lifeline. The next morning, David walked into the diner, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The familiar smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, but it did nothing to ease the tension in his chest. He spotted Johnson sitting in a booth near the back, nursing a cup of coffee. His face was tired, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced with a grim seriousness. David slid into the booth across from him, the silence between them thick and heavy. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the unspoken tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "How have you been holding up?" Johnson finally asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. David shrugged, his voice barely a whisper. "Not great." Johnson nodded, but his eyes didn't meet David's. He swirled the coffee in his cup, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Yeah, I figured." The silence stretched on again, and David could feel his stomach knotting. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say that Johnson hadn't already heard, that he hadn't already seen with his own eyes? Johnson sighed, breaking the silence. "The protests are getting worse. It's everywhere now, the news, social media, the department. People are pissed, and it's only getting bigger." David nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to look at Johnson. "I know. I've seen it." Johnson finally set his coffee cup down and leaned forward, his eyes locking onto David's. "This isn't just about you anymore. David, it's not just about Green either. It's about the entire system. The department is under fire, and everyone's scrambling to figure out how to fix this." David's heart sank. He had known the situation was bad, but hearing it laid out like this made it feel even worse. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore, he had become the face of a larger battle, one that stretched far beyond him. Johnson's voice softened, but the disappointment was still there. "Look, I've been trying to stay out of it, but people are angry." David armed a lot of the guys. "They're blaming you." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had expected anger, disappointment, but hearing it spelled out so plainly made the reality of his situation even harder to swallow. "I didn't want this," David said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this way." Johnson's expression softened slightly, but the tension between them remained. "I know, but it did. And now we all have to live with the fallout." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. Outside, the world continued to turn, but for David, everything had come to a screeching halt. Back at his apartment later that day, David sat in the dark, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and regret. The protests outside continued to grow, the chants echoing through the night. The investigation was looming, and his career was slipping further out of reach. And the worst part was, he didn't know how to fix it. The courthouse buzzed with an energy that made David's stomach churn. The day had come. The internal investigation had concluded, and now the disciplinary hearing awaited him. He sat stiffly in the waiting area outside the courtroom, staring blankly ahead, trying to make sense of how everything had spiraled so far out of his control. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but no matter how much he tried to calm himself, one idea kept resurfacing: this was the end. Outside, the protests had reached a fever pitch. The streets were filled with people chanting, holding signs, demanding accountability not just for David's actions but for what he had come to represent. The city had become a battleground, and the arrest of Captain Marcus Green had been the spark that set everything ablaze. David glanced at his phone again, seeing the same relentless flood of notifications. His name was still trending. The news media had painted him as a symbol of institutional racism, as the embodiment of everything wrong with policing. His face, captured on countless videos of the arrest, had become infamous, and the videos hadn't stopped coming. New angles, new commentary, more public outrage. It seemed like the world wouldn't rest until David was ruined. Across from him, his union lawyer, Mr. Harding, sat flipping through a file of documents, his face impassive. Harding had been cold and pragmatic throughout this entire process, and David couldn't shake the feeling that the man had already resigned himself to the inevitable outcome. Every conversation they'd had over the last few weeks had been the same: prepare for the worst. But David wasn't prepared. How could anyone be prepared for this? He had joined the police force to make a difference, to protect and serve, and now he was on the verge of losing everything because of one mistake. The shame and fear gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The door to the hearing room opened, and a court officer stepped out, signaling it was time. David's stomach flipped as he stood up, trying to steel himself for what was coming. Harding gave him a curt nod and stood as well, his file in hand. "Just follow my lead," Harding muttered as they walked toward the door. "This is damage control now. The best we can do is minimize the fallout." David barely heard him. His heart was pounding in his ears, and all he could focus on was the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a hearing, it was his entire career, his life, hanging in the balance. They stepped into the hearing room, where a panel of senior officers sat at the front, their expressions somber and unreadable. In the audience behind them, other officers, reporters, and members of the public filled the seats. David could feel the tension in the room, the way every eye seemed to bore into him as he walked to the front and took his seat. The hearing began with a recitation of the facts, the day of the arrest, the circumstances leading up to it, and the fallout that had followed. The panel members listened intently, their faces impassive as they went over the details that David had heard 100 times by now. He had given his statement, admitted that he had not recognized Captain Green, but the narrative had already been shaped long before he'd had a chance to explain himself. As the facts were laid out, David's mind wandered back to the day of the arrest. He could still see it clearly in his mind, the way Greenade stood there, calm and composed, while David had spiraled into fear and defensiveness. He hadn't meant to escalate things the way he had, but once the wheels were in motion, it had been impossible to stop. And now, here he was, paying the price. The panel chair, a stoic senior officer named Captain Reynolds, finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Thompson, we've heard the facts of the case. Now we need to hear from you. What do you have to say for yourself?" David swallowed hard, his throat dry as he stared at the panel. This was his moment to speak, to defend himself. But what could he say that would change anything? The evidence was clear. The videos had been played over and over again in the public eye. His actions had been scrutinized, dissected, and condemned. I didn't recognize Captain Green," David began, his voice shaky. "I was patrolling the area, and I saw someone I thought was acting suspiciously. I followed protocol. Or at least I thought I was following protocol." His words felt hollow, even to him. He could see the skepticism in the eyes of the panel members, could feel the weight of their judgment. I never meant for things to escalate the way they did, he continued, his voice faltering. I realize now that I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that I'm deeply sorry. I've spent my entire career trying to protect this city, trying to do the right thing, but that day I failed. The room was silent, the weight of David's confession hanging in the air. He glanced at Harding, who gave him a subtle nod, as if to say that was all he could do. Now it was in the hands of the panel. Captain Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. Officer Thompson, you say you were following protocol, but it's clear from the footage that your actions were not in line with proper procedure. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalation, and in doing so you not only arrested a fellow officer but also contributed to a breakdown in public trust. Do you understand the gravity of that? David nodded weakly, his hands trembling in his lap. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Reynolds' gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. This department has been under intense scrutiny since the incident. The public is demanding accountability, and we cannot afford to ignore that. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to the reputation of this department, and while I believe that you acted out of fear rather than malice, the consequences remain the same. David's heart sank. He could see where this was going, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. Reynolds continued, This hearing is about determining whether you should remain on the force. Given the circumstances, we have no choice but to recommend your termination, effective immediately. The words hit David like a physical blow. His chest tightened, and for a moment he struggled to breathe. He had known this was coming, had prepared himself for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all too real. Do you have anything else to say? Reynolds asked, her tone softening slightly. David shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. No. With that, the decision was made. The panel concluded the hearing, and David was officially terminated from the police force. The room buzzed with whispers and murmurs as he stood up, feeling numb. Harding gave him a pat on the shoulder, murmuring something about next steps, but David barely heard him. His mind was spinning, his chest tight with the weight of everything that had just happened. As he walked out of the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted. Protesters lined the streets, chanting and waving their signs, demanding justice and reform. David kept his head down, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible to escape the intensity of the moment. His phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't ignore it. He glanced down and saw a message from his lawyer. We'll need to prepare for the civil suit. Green's family is moving forward with charges. David's heart sank further. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Weeks passed, and David's world continued to crumble. The civil suit loomed large on the horizon, and the media storm around the case showed no signs of dying down. He had been thrust into the center of a national conversation about race, policing, and accountability, and every day it felt like the walls were closing in a little more. He had lost his job, his reputation, and nearly all of his friends. The apartment that had once been his refuge now felt like a prison, and every time he stepped outside he was met with whispers, stares, and sometimes outright hostility. The city had turned against him, and he couldn't blame them. One night, as David sat alone in his darkened apartment, his thoughts swirling, his phone buzzed with another notification. He had long since stopped checking them, but something compelled him to look this time. It was a video, yet another one related to the case, but this time it wasn't footage of the arrest. It was an interview with Captain Marcus Green. David's breath caught in his throat as he watched Green speak calmly to the interviewer, recounting the day of the arrest. I don't hold hate in my heart for Officer Thompson, Green said, his voice steady. But what happened that day was a reflection of something much bigger than the two of us. It was about the system we're all a part of, and the biases that exist within it. David's chest tightened as Green continued. I believe that Thompson made a mistake. But it's a mistake that's been made too many times in too many places. And it's time we start addressing the root causes of these issues, not just the symptoms. The interview ended, and David sat in stunned silence. Greener wasn't vilifying him. He wasn't calling for his head. Instead, he was calling for something larger, for change, for reform, for the very things that David had once believed in, but had somehow lost along the way. Tears filled David's eyes as he sat in the dark, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had lost so much: his career, his friends, his sense of self. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make things right. Not for himself, but for the future. He wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, and the pain of what he had done would never fully leave him. But for the first time in weeks, David felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps he could still find a way to contribute, even if it was from the outside. Perhaps, in his own way, he could still make a difference. The days following David's termination felt like a blur. Each morning he woke up with the same sinking feeling in his gut, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him as soon as his eyes opened. The world outside his small apartment was still moving, still buzzing with protests, news reports, and heated conversations about race, policing, and accountability. But for David, everything had come to a standstill. His badge, once a source of pride, now sat abandoned in a drawer. His uniform, folded neatly in the back of his closet, was a reminder of a life he no longer had. His phone was constantly lighting up with notifications from news outlets, reporters asking for interviews, and former colleagues who were either sympathetic or, more often than not, angry. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. David had lost his job. He had lost his reputation, and now he was on the verge of losing everything else. The civil lawsuit filed by Captain Marcus Green's family loomed over him like a dark cloud. Every day, new developments in the case were splashed across the headlines, and each one brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety. But the worst part wasn't the lawsuit. It wasn't even the media firestorm that had engulfed him. The worst part was the silence. The quiet that filled his apartment, the empty space where his life used to be. The friends he once had, the purpose he once felt, the sense of belonging, all of it was gone. David had never felt so alone. Weeks turned into months, and the civil suit dragged on. David's lawyer, Harding, kept him informed of every new motion, every piece of evidence submitted by Green's legal team. The case was building steadily, and it was clear that Green's family had a strong argument. David had no delusions about the outcome. He knew that he would likely lose. He had already lost so much. What was a little more? Harding had urged him to settle the case out of court, to avoid the humiliation of a public trial. The prospect of another media circus terrified David, and after long discussions with his lawyer, he had reluctantly agreed to a settlement. It wasn't ideal, nothing about this situation was, but it was the only way to bring some semblance of closure to this nightmare. The settlement didn't absolve David of the guilt he carried. It didn't erase the shame he felt every time he saw his own reflection, but it did allow him to take the first steps toward rebuilding his life, even if those steps were small and uncertain. One evening, after weeks of avoiding the news, David found himself once again scrolling through his phone. He had long since stopped reading the articles about himself, but something compelled him to look this time. A new headline caught his eye. City to implement sweeping reforms after Green incident. Mayor announces new measures to address racial bias in policymaking. David's heart skipped a beat as he read the article. The mayor, in response to the public outcry and the protests that had engulfed the city for months, had announced a series of reforms aimed at addressing racial bias in law enforcement. Mandatory bias training for all officers, increased oversight of police conduct, community outreach programs, the list went on. It was exactly the kind of change that Marcus Green had called for in his interview weeks earlier, and it was the kind of change that David had once believed in, long before everything had gone so wrong. As he read through the article, A strange sense of hope flickered inside him. He had become the symbol of the problem. His actions had sparked a movement that had swept through the city. But perhaps, in some twisted way, he had also contributed to the solution. The reforms wouldn't undo what he had done, but maybe they could prevent it from happening again. David closed his eyes and let out a long breath. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a small sense of peace. He had been at the center of a firestorm, but from the ashes, something good was emerging. It didn't absolve him of his mistakes, but it gave him a reason to believe that, in the end, something positive could come from all of this. Despite the settlement, the media coverage, and the reforms, David's life remained a shadow of what it once was. He had applied for dozens of jobs since his termination, but each application was met with silence. No one wanted to hire the disgraced cop at the center of a national scandal. His savings were running dry, and the prospect of having to leave the city he had once served loomed larger each day. But even in his darkest moments, David couldn't shake the feeling that he still had something to offer. He had made mistakes, grave mistakes, but he had also learned from them. And now, as the city moved forward with its reforms, he began to wonder if there was still a way for him to contribute to that change. One afternoon, as David walked through the streets of the city, he found himself standing in front of a community center that had been at the heart of the protests. It was a modest building, but its walls were covered in murals depicting unity, justice, and hope. The sight of it stirred something inside him. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether he should go inside. But before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed open the door and stepped in. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. People of all ages and backgrounds were gathered, talking, organizing, and working on projects aimed at bettering the community. A woman behind the front desk greeted him with a smile, her eyes kind and curious. "Can I help you?" she asked. David cleared his throat, suddenly feeling nervous. I was wondering if there's any way I could help. Volunteer, maybe." The woman looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. We're always looking for people who want to get involved. What's your name?" David hesitated for a split second before answering. David Thompson." He half expected the woman's smile to falter, for her to recognize his name and turn him away. But instead, she simply nodded and handed him a clipboard. "Well, David, we're glad to have you. Just fill this out, and we'll get you started." David took the clipboard and sat down at a nearby table, his hands shaking slightly as he filled out the form. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, wasn't sure what he was hoping to accomplish. But as he sat there, surrounded by people working together to make the city a better place, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in months. In the weeks that followed, David became a regular at the community center. He volunteered wherever he was needed, helping with food drives, organizing events, cleaning up the neighborhood. The work was humbling, far removed from the power and authority he had once held as a police officer, but in a strange way, it was exactly what he needed. Through his work at the center, David began to reconnect with the city he had once served. He met people from all walks of life, listened to their stories, and slowly started to rebuild the trust he had lost. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of people who still recognized him, who still saw him as the officer who had arrested Captain Green. But over time, some of those walls began to come down. One day, as David was helping to organize a neighborhood cleanup, he saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was Marcus Green. David's heart raced as he watched Green approach. He hadn't seen him since the day of the hearing, and he wasn't sure what to expect. Would Greenie be angry? Would he resent David for everything that had happened? But as Green came closer, he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that took David by surprise. "David," Green said, extending his hand, "it's good to see you." David hesitated for a moment before shaking Green's hand. "It's good to see you too, Captain." Green chuckled softly. "I'm not your captain anymore, just Marcus." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I never got the chance to apologize properly, he said quietly, for everything. Green's smile faded slightly, but there was no anger in his eyes. I know. And I appreciate that. But like I said in that interview, this was never just about you and me. This is about something bigger. And from what I can see, you're doing your part to make things right. David swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. I'm trying, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Green nodded. That's all any of us can do. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. But in that silence, there was also a sense of understanding of forgiveness, perhaps not fully spoken but felt nonetheless. As Green turned to leave, David watched him go, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over him. He still had a long way to go, still had much to make up for. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.